You have my deepest admiration of making a journey here for Sunday morning, interrupting your routines and schedules of no doubt going to coffee shop someplace and reading the paper, or not reading the paper as the case might be, but looking at the age of the group, reading on the internet rather. Thank you, members of the foundation, for the kind invitation to come today and share some thoughts and experiences. I'm extremely gratified to see so many young faces, and hope that some of my comments and observations may prove to be of some use or value to you as you chart your course in life. I gave this title, Principle Not Policy, for a very specific reason. As we look at the world we live in, if you're reading the news on the internet, or you're watching it on television, or even talking to your friends, you can see the public discourse around which we are engaged today is fraught with inadequacies. We find ourselves shouting at each other, shouting over each other, declaring, I have the correct view, you have the incorrect view. We see people, so-called gurus on television, telling us what we should believe. We don't even agree on basic facts about things that are facing us as a people and as a society. We find ourselves trying to address complex problems through very inadequate means. Trying to deal with health care. I don't know about you, most of you are quite young, but the older you get, the more that becomes quite a challenge. I'm a reasonably intelligent person. I'm completely confused about health care. I can't figure this out. I don't know what's right or wrong. I try to read different sources of information, and none of them seem to make any sense. Financial regulation, no doubt your parents are more worried about it, perhaps you are, is another cycle of frustrating experiences trying to understand how do you organize a society, ensure that people's property rights and interests are protected, and at the same time create a society where productive people can engage. And yet, again, you look in the public discourse, it's impossible to sort this out from the way people are conducting themselves. The information filters the news media put on our news, it's like a gauze. And each of the sources of information that come from different channels, whether it's New York Times, Fox News, or whatever you tend to listen to, Comedy Channel, Jon Stewart, all of them have a bent. They're all translating in a way to influence your thinking and your decision making. I want to underscore what Sharon just made as the outset as a principle, and this is a principle that I would urge you to consider at your early age as you begin a career both in college and afterwards, is that you really can't rely on anybody or any source of information to define who you are and what you believe. On a daily basis, and I don't mean to exaggerate, I read 7 newspapers, I look at least 5 to 7 different websites, and they range the entire political spectrum. And even doing so, I'm relatively certain I really don't understand what is being reported. So it creates a level of uncertainty in actually what can I believe and what can't I not believe. But what I have understood, the older I've gotten, it's my responsibility in mine alone to find out what is true and what is not true. And I can't give that responsibility to someone else. And so underscoring this is a central principle, that is that each of us independently has to investigate the truth. Each of us has to measure it. Each of us has to look at the sources of information and not necessarily do what we tend to do, which is look at those sources which are most like our own prejudices and preferences, which reinforce what we already believe, and then unfortunately often create a somewhat distorted view. This is going to be more of a talk about personal experiences. It's not going to be an esoteric reference. I'm going to talk about personal things that I've been involved in throughout my adult life, and focusing on principle as a way to build patterns of unity of thought and unity of purpose. I think it's important to understand that most of us are accustomed to looking at problems and immediately, maybe you're like me, I'm from the ready, fire, aim school. As soon as I see a problem, I see a solution, and let's just move on. I've had to cultivate a whole new discipline. And the first step in that process is to ask myself, what principles are at risk here? What principles are involved in this? What principles might be relevant here? And in doing so, cultivate a whole method of engaging the reality around me. I confess this is not something I do very well. I confess it's something I'm challenged by constantly. But nonetheless, I've had some experiences which I think might be useful. You know, even the word governance, it's an interesting word, is a Greek word, means steering. I know, not that you hear this word and you have the sense it means governing, but it actually, the origin is steering things. So I'm going to talk about how I steered some things. My background, a little bit more on my background, which will give you a better understanding of why I'm looking at through this prism and what these experiences have been. For more than 40 years, I worked in the field of justice and justice administration. For 20 years, I was the chief administrative officer of the courts of California, chief administrative officer for the federal courts in the western United States, called the Circuit Executive, 14 states and 3 territories, and administrative director of the courts in the state of Kentucky, my home state. And during the past 20 years, I formed a consulting firm working on justice and justice reform issues throughout the world, and have been involved in excess of 50 countries. Those countries range from Chile, where I spent 5 years, to Palestine, to Jordan, to Afghanistan, to Congo, to Haiti, Honduras, El Salvador, Argentina, Liberia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so forth. It's been a fantastic ride. I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been born at this time and having the opportunity to be engaged in issues so central as justice at this time in history. So when I come to the topic of governance, I come from the perspective, I'm a do person. This is not an esoteric discussion. I'm not going to talk about ideas in the abstract. I'm going to talk about how do you actually resolve or find ways to resolve difficult problems or overcome challenges that represent enormous hurdles in the growth and development of a country. I'd like to start by referencing a couple of books that I found extremely useful and encourage those who are so inclined to look at. One is called Why Nations Fail. Why Nations Fail. It's an exhaustive and recently published book where the authors have actually done some very serious research in looking at patterns of governance across history, and they find that in that there are 2 really dominant patterns that emerge. One is they call an a inclusive institutional approach, and another is called an extractive institutional approach. I'll define that. The inclusive institutional approach is where those who govern start with the premise that they can trust the people they govern. That their function is to create the conditions which enable people to prosper. They try to reduce barriers. They try to create open societies where dialogue and discourse are facilitated, where people can openly express their views and not in fear of retribution. And conversely, an extractive government is where they concentrate power in the hands of an elite. And in this, they have no constraints on the exercise of power. I think poignantly today, we can see the drama unfolding in North and South Korea. two very clear examples of these polar opposites, where the extractive power is consolidated into the hands of a family, basically, and a few resources in South Korea, which is a pluralistic society and far more open. And the drama of that unfolding before our very eyes gives evidence to the very findings of these gentlemen who wrote this book. Why is that important? Because if you start with the premise that you're going to foster a development in a society where people have the freedom to gather publicly, to discourse and challenge each other on ideas, it creates the framework around which you can build unity. Conversely, the opposite is true. So what we see here is the clearest example of starting with a principle of openness. Look at the growth and development of South Korea, look at the closure of North Korea. There can't be two more dramatic examples of this very point. So the principle being, you want to foster a society that encourages, nurtures, that allows people to be open, and that has a central element in it, that is, we can trust the people we govern. When we lose that trust, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment, it creates a destabilizing dimension in a society, something which I think is quite prevalent in the United States today. Interestingly, I'm not sure how many of you know anything about the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon himself said it was his greatest contribution to humankind. That was to write a code for civil and criminal procedure, to define rights and responsibilities. It was his way of saying civilization will prosper by the application of my code, which will define all these rights and responsibilities. It's interesting, in this code, it makes several key assumptions which have affected the evolution and development of much of the world. It starts with the presumption that the state is always right. It vests no inherent responsibility in the citizen. The citizen always has to, for example, in the Napoleonic Criminal Code, you have to prove your innocence, not the other way around. You have to prove, even though the state has charged you with a crime, you have to prove your innocence. It starts with a presumption that the state has a higher degree of knowledge about matters that affect your life. It has affected, and I think quite negatively, the development of Latin America, Africa, and much of the Middle East. It is increasingly eroded, but it has had that effect. Again, signalizing this concept that only a few people know what's best, and we're going to write it for you, and you have to adhere to that. So in neighboring Mexico, for example, Mexico is undergoing now the biggest change in the history of Mexico. It's transiting from the inquisitorial criminal process, which is characterized by these characteristics, to an accusatory process, which is where you start with a presumption of innocence. This is very fundamental. I've been involved in this for the last 20 years in Latin America. It's so fundamental as to hard, there's no time today to discuss it. But it's something that you should, if you're not concerned about it, I encourage you to investigate it. Now on a more personal level, principle. What does this mean? Well, it's a nice thing to say, I believe in principle. I was the director of the Administrative Office of Courts in Kentucky. What is that? That's an office that organizes and delivers justice throughout the entire system. We were living in California. We moved back to Kentucky. I drove a truck and went back to Kentucky, and that's where I'm from. I registered to vote. It was in December. There are no elections in December, as you know. I registered on a Friday, and Monday morning I went to work the very first day. I was in the office 5 minutes, and a phone call came, and the phone said, "You have to take this call." I said, "I'm sorry, I'm just meeting the staff. I don't know them." Shaking hands, and "Please take a message." And the lady said, "No, you have to take this call." I said, "Well, what in the world?" And the phone, I picked up the phone. I said, "Yes, this is Bill Davis." He said, "You've made a mistake." I said, "I'm 5 minutes here. What mistake?" He said, "Well, you registered as an independent. We don't have independents in Kentucky. We have Democrats." So the first point for me, the first point being, as a matter of principle, I'm independent. And right away I was engaged on the subject of, do I become a Democrat? Of course I didn't, but I want to go through this. This is the reality of people who work in the world that we live in. People are organized on tribal basis, tribes being Republicans, tribes being Democrats. And they want adherence. And if you don't have principles to stand by, you will be drawn into that system and lose your independence in the process. I won't go on, there's not enough time to talk all about that. I want to talk about two other examples in a complete other different part of the world, Jordan. In one of our most interesting projects, in Jordan, well, let me put it this way. In Arabic, when you say the word wasta, wasta means nepotism, it means discretion. In one word, embedded in one word, a whole series of concepts that are integral to the way the Arab culture works. And in that one word, it says, this is how we get things done. Wasta is the way I will appoint my son to be a position. It will be the way I will get a contract to a neighbor. It's a way I will take care of my friends. So in Jordan, we're faced with the dilemma of a king who wanted to modernize his country, and yet they were relying on wasta to do everything. So how do you deal with that from a principle standpoint? If we try to address it straight on and confront wasta, we know we're not going to have any success. So we find and we create a discourse with the judicial leadership that modernizing the Jordanian judiciary should be our overarching task, because that's what the king has identified as the most important agenda for the future of the country. What does modernizing a judiciary look like? Well, first of all, instead of judges being appointed by friendship, you create a merit-based system so people can apply for jobs. Another factor in Jordan is 65% of the population is Palestinian. The Palestinians can't get access to government jobs. Only those who are traditionally members of the Hashemite kingdom, family, extended family, get access to jobs. Only 3% of the judiciary is women. So you create a merit-based exam of which more than 60% of the applicants are Palestinian, and of which more than half of them are women. And what happens is, in 5 years out, 15% of the judiciary is now women, and more than half of the new judges are Palestinian in origin. So the point I want to exercise and explain to you is principle, not policy. We started with the principle, how do you modernize? And then from that, you create a dynamic which says, we want to encourage the access of women to positions of influence. Now, it's a matter of principle for me. I have the obligation as a man to promote women in every way possible. That's an obligation I feel I have personally. So in this context, we took this principle, translated it, created a setting where people could participate, give their own thoughts, but then they took the initiative to create a whole new system of selecting and creating judgeships for the people of Jordan. Now, on 2 occasions, there have been attempts to undo this, and the good fortune is both the king and the queen of Jordan have intervened twice to stop and undo what has been done. Changing culture is never easy. It's very difficult, and it is never done in a short period of time. So my third example will be the Dominican Republic, coming more to this hemisphere. There's widespread public perception about corruption in the Dominican Republic. And in a meeting with the Chief Justice, he turned to me and he said, I don't understand what we need to do to create a greater sense of unity of purpose within our judicial system about how we can deliver justice better and have greater integrity. We ask ourselves, well, if there's, and you know this, if you read the paper, the perceptions of corruption are widespread. And most of the recipes for addressing corruption are create codes of ethics, create panels, do things external. we were quite frustrated by that approach. And it seemed to me that we're asking the wrong question. And the first question for us was, what principle is at stake here? And looking at it from this perspective, we drew on this principle. O Son of Spirit, I created thee rich. Why dost thou bring thyself to poverty? Noble, I created thee. Wherewith dost thou abase thyself? So the principle being, if we've been created noble, why aren't we manifesting our internal nobility when we conduct our affairs? What's impeding us in doing that? And what we found is, quite honestly, no one had ever been talked to about their internal nobility. The whole idea of nobility was a very, very strange concept. And in a country where original sin is a doctrine that everyone believes in, the notion that you've been created noble was a very, very unusual concept. So how do you address that? Well, you do it with the arts. And the first thing that we've learned is if you want to build a pattern of unity, you've got to build a foundation of indisputable facts to start with, because people will discourse phrase at the edges when people don't have an agreement about the essential facts. How do you do that? We ask a group to survey the public and walk through the streets of Santo Domingo and other parts of the Dominican Republic and ask the public, what did they think about corruption in the judicial system? And they said horrendous things. Then we asked this group, don't write a report. We said, please convert this into a dramatic presentation, because you can't change hearts through the head. You change hearts through the heart. Consequently, what we did is they created a rap. Not my favorite kind of music. I would have been happier with salsa, but that was what they wanted to do. So they created a rap, and they used the language of the people in the community, what they said. So they did the first presentation. I'm sitting next to the Chief Justice, tears running down his face. And he says to me, he says, they're talking about me. And I knew we had made the breakthrough, because when you want in change, if you're using a principle, you want change, people to identify, this is about me. It's not about somebody else. So if we are created noble, our first task is to recognize that inherent nobility. We then followed that up with a whole series of processes which culminated in each person, now over 10,000, have written a covenant to themselves of the values and virtues they're going to give expression to in the way they conduct their professional activities and their personal activities. And a covenant to all their colleagues in the justice system in the community where they reside on how they will conduct their affairs. Now that's how you build a cultural response and combat a very deep-seated pattern of cultural deviance, if I can say it in that manner. You know, I'm from the South, and talking fast is really stressful. So I'm trying to get through it, and I'm looking at that clock, and I'm thinking, holy cow. I'll underscore the couple of things here and leave it at this, because we have some fantastic presentations today. In these 3 short vignettes, what I tried to communicate to you is I encourage you to think differently about the world you live in. In reviewing the political science literature and preparing for this, and there's a journal called Governance. And in the March issue on Governance, Francis Fukuyama, who's one of the most prolific writers on this topic, cites that we do not even have a coherent and agreed upon definition of good governance. He further cites that we don't have good information to measure good governance, etc. But what he doesn't say is that we don't have agreed upon principles to measure governance. We're arguing about policies. And ultimately, what I would hope that you would get from this brief presentation is that each of us needs to think in terms of how I will develop the disciplined approach of looking for principle when I'm challenged by a situation, and then develop policy from that. And if I can cultivate that capacity, will my actions lead to greater patterns of unity and harmony? And the world we live in, which is can be characterized by higher and higher degrees of conflict and further fracturing of the social fabric, we desperately need a larger number of people who understand that our primary function is to build unity and harmony and not to destroy one another. Thank you for your time.